Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this panel discussion sponsored by the Institute of World Politics. My name is John Lenchowski. I'm the founder and President Emeritus and Chancellor, currently Chancellor here at IWP. And for those of you who are new to IWP, we are an independent graduate school of international affairs, national security, and intelligence. We offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degree programs, including 2 of them are online, and 18 graduate certificates of study. If you're interested a little bit more about us and in studying with us, please feel free to talk to one of our staff or visit us online at our website, which is iwp.edu. Before I introduce our moderator, I'd like first to thank all of the supporters of the school and those who make IWP events like this possible. Especially today, I'd like to thank Philip Linderman and Melinda Kimball. To support our work, please visit iwp.edu/donate. Now I'd like to introduce Ambassador Louise Oliver. Ambassador Oliver served as the permanent representative of the United States to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, from 2004 to 2009. She was the first U.S. ambassador to UNESCO in 20 years. Ambassador Oliver led the re-engagement with this Paris-based organization, and her leadership was particularly valuable in areas such as global literacy, particularly for women and girls, clean water, world heritage, and freedom of expression. I personally was so impressed with her leadership because in an organization like this, the United States doesn't enjoy the use of the veto. And she managed to make an extraordinary number of diplomatic successes and prevent diplomatic disasters by dint of her own diplomatic skill. She wrote an excellent article about multilateral diplomacy that appeared in the Ambassador's Review, and I included in my course on international relations as a required reading. So before her appointment to UNESCO, Ambassador Oliver worked with a number of nonprofit organizations and educational institutions. She served in the Office of Presidential Personnel in the White House, in the Department of Education, as a commissioner on the National Commission for Children. After returning from Paris, she served as president of the French American Cultural Foundation, and she's currently a distinguished fellow here at IWP, as well as a director at the Council for American Ambassadors. Ambassador Oliver, we're honored that you would come and do this, and we would love to have you introduce our guests and panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be introduced by you. So thank you. And before I get embarked on UNESCO, I want to thank Sarah Dwyer and her team for all the incredible work that you all have done to help put this event together. Thank you so much, Sarah. So today, UNESCO 3.0. Why 3.0? Well, because, of course, President Biden returned to UNESCO last summer, and it was the 3rd time that the U.S. joined that organization. The U.S. joined UNESCO for the first time in November 1945 when it helped found UNESCO, a UN specialized agency designed to help prevent another horrific war. At that time, countries felt that wars are a result of a misunderstanding among countries. And Archibald MacLeish, the U.S. Poet Laureate, summed it up in the opening lines of UNESCO's Constitution, which says, and I quote, "Since wars begin in the minds of men, It is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed, unquote. So UNESCO was supposed to be the intellectual arm of the UN, which would promote peace and security by having countries work together in areas like education, like science, like culture. Information and communication were added later. And member states chose artists and writers and academics and scientists to represent them at the organization. But all that changed in 1954 with the so-called Japanese Amendment that said the delegates from UNESCO's member states would henceforth be considered official representatives of their respective governments. Now, the U.S. supported that amendment. Since it paid 22% of UNESCO's budget, it needed to show that U.S. taxpayer funds given to that organization would be used to advance U.S. national interest and security. But that amendment transformed UNESCO into a classic UN intergovernmental organization that member states could and would use as a tool to promote their respective foreign policies. The result was that over time, UNESCO became increasingly polarized, less transparent, less accountable, and by the 1980s, dominated by the Soviet Union and its lackeys. So, December 1984, President Reagan shocked the world by taking the U.S. out of UNESCO. He stated that UNESCO had become corrupt and mismanaged under its Director General, Amadou Mbow, and that he did not want any more U.S. taxpayer dollars going to an organization that promoted policies that actively undermined U.S. values and national interests. Now, I was working in the White House at that time, and I remember hearing the discussions about whether, when an organization starts to go bad, do you stay in it and try and fix it? Or do you leave it and say, reform yourselves, maybe we'll come back? Needless to say, I had no idea that many years later I would be representing the U.S. at UNESCO. In October 2003, the U.S. became a member of UNESCO for the second time. Things had changed. UNESCO's Director General, Koichiro Matsuura, was a very pro-American and skilled Japanese diplomat who worked hard to try and reform the organization. And President George W. Bush had invaded Iraq in response to the attacks on 9/11. And he hoped that by rejoining UNESCO, he would get more international support for his war on terror. And President Bush also wanted to address the roots of terror by promoting human rights, tolerance, and learning through UNESCO. And since Mrs. Bush had been appointed as the UN ambassador for the Decade of Literacy, education was a top priority for him. And I became the U.S. Permanent Representative to UNESCO in early 2004, and as John said, led the re-entry back into UNESCO, which is when I first had the pleasure of meeting with these and working with these two gentlemen who will be our debaters this evening. I spent 5 years at UNESCO, actively engaged in hands-on multilateral diplomacy, trying, not always successfully, to advance U.S. national interests through that organization. But all that changed, again, 2011, when Palestine decided it wanted to be a full member of the UN and not just an observer state. But that was impossible in New York at the UN because of a potential U.S. veto. The UN is an organization for sovereign states, and the U.S. does not recognize Palestine as a sovereign state. But, as John mentioned, the U.S. does not have a veto at UNESCO. So when Palestine applied to join UNESCO, our U.S. ambassador warned his colleagues that if Palestine was elected as a full member of the organization, it would trigger 2 congressional laws that state that any UN organization that elects Palestine as a full member will lose all U.S. funding. Despite this warning, Palestine was elected as UNESCO's 195th member with 107 votes in favor, 14 opposed, and 52 abstentions. U.S. funding for UNESCO stopped the next day. In December 2018, the U.S. was taken out of UNESCO for the second time. this time by President Trump. The U.S. annual dues payment was about $80 million a year, still 22% of UNESCO's budget. And after several years of unpaid dues, the U.S. lost its voting rights at UNESCO. And after another 6 years or so, U.S. arrears amounted to almost $500 million. Plus, UNESCO had developed a serious anti-Israel bias. And since the U.S. no longer had any power or influence left at UNESCO, President Trump decided that remaining a member of that organization was really not an option. And Israel also left UNESCO. In July 2023, the U.S. became a member of UNESCO for the third time. As a fan of multilateral diplomacy, President Biden wanted to return to UNESCO as soon as he took office, but he could not do so because of the laws preventing U.S. funds from going to UNESCO. Because these are congressional laws, only the Congress had the ability to change them. So Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, inserted a temporary waiver to these laws in the 2023 $1.7 trillion Consolidated Voting Act. And Senator Coons got support from his congressional colleagues to do this by telling them that the reason the U.S. had to return to UNESCO was to prevent China from increasing its influence at the organization. And when asked about the problem of Palestine, the State Department spokesman simply said it would be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So now what? Given its history with UNESCO, will the U.S. be able to exert its leadership at UNESCO once again? And how will the U.S. deal with China at UNESCO, especially since its Deputy Director General is a Chinese diplomat? And how will the U.S. deal with UNESCO initiatives it does not like, since it has no veto? So can the U.S. advance its foreign policy goals in UNESCO totally polarized by the Israeli-Hamas war? So all this brings us back to the question we'll be debating this evening. Was President Biden's decision to rejoin UNESCO a good one? Now, our two debaters were distinguished career Foreign Service officers with many years of experience in international affairs. Mr. Stephen Engelken spent 38 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. He served in numerous postings abroad, including Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, Italy, France, Pakistan, and Australia. And in Washington, he served in offices at the State Department dealing with Pakistan-Bangladesh affairs, proliferation threat reduction, peacekeeping and humanitarian operations, and Arabian Peninsula affairs, all very challenging assignments. However, I suspect that the 3 years he spent with me in Paris as the deputy chief of the U.S. mission to UNESCO, and then as chargé d'affaires, were among the most frustrating and difficult of his career, given the complexity and complete unpredictability of UNESCO. Mr. Engelken holds a BA from George Washington University and is a graduate of the prestigious École Nationale d'Administration in France. He speaks Italian, Arabic, and French, which was very valuable at UNESCO, where both French and English are the two working languages. Mr. Anderson serves as the Director of Administration and Finance from 2014 to 2021 at the DC-based Pan American Health Organization, and before that at the Organization of American States, also in DC. Prior to these responsibilities, Mr. Anderson spent 30 years as a career Foreign Service officer, serving in Warsaw, Tel Aviv, Seoul, Jerusalem, and other places, as well as at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. And Mr. Anderson and I worked together when he served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Affairs at the State Department. But despite his experience in multilateral diplomacy, I'm sure that he found working with UNESCO equally frustrating and challenging. In fact, some of his colleagues, I'm sure, would have called it a nightmare. Mr. Anderson holds a BA from Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, and an MA from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in DC. And my thanks to both of you for being willing to debate each other tonight. We will start with presentations from each of our debaters. And then they will have a few minutes to answer each other's comments. And then after that, we'll turn it over to questions from the floor. Thank you very much. And Mr. Anderson, let's start with you. Tell us why it was a good decision to go back to UNESCO.
Let's see. Where's that little
Where's
clicker?
the clicker?
Here it is. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Lenchovsky and all of his team here at the Institute of World Politics for hosting this event, and thank Ambassador Louise Oliver for being a relentless instigator of all sorts of events related to UNESCO these many years after completing her service there. And I'm very happy to be on a podium with Steve Engelken, who worked with Ambassador Oliver and me during those years that were indeed frustrating, but very productive in terms of the things we were able to achieve in an administration that was Republican, in an organization that was starting at suspicious of and moving toward, at times, hostility to the United States. So what I'd like to do, Ambassador Oliver has given you a short history of U.S. engagement with UNESCO and asked, was the most recent decision of the Biden administration to rejoin the right decision or not? And as I was reflecting on that topic, I thought it might be useful to share with you a framework for thinking about this kind of a decision, and also to call your attention to the relationship between the United States' role at UNESCO and the United States' relationship in the world more broadly. So let's see if I can get this right. First of all, I'd like us to think briefly about the United States' role in the world generally. What do we think the United States should do in the world? And I thought of three. There are many, many things the United States does in the world, but as they relate to our topic today, I think these three that I put on this very succinct screen are important. First of all, engine of innovation. The United States has innovated in almost every possible area of human endeavor, but I wanted to mention just a few that are related to our topic. First of all, in the area of industry, the U.S. brought the world mass production, extensive agriculture that made us the breadbasket of the world, information technology that created the cyberspace that we now all live in, and space travel. In the area of health, the United States brought the world antibiotics and vaccines, which were the foundation of amazing achievements in public health around the world. In the economic area, the United States founded the global financial system through the Bretton Woods Accords at the end of World War II, and also the global trading system, which features the World Trade Organization, which is another one of those very frustrating multilateral organizations for the United States to operating in. And in the diplomatic field, the United States gave the world NATO, probably the most successful military alliance in history, based on the results achieved in the Cold War. But the United States also gave the world the United Nations system. And I just wanted us all to recall, just for a moment, that it was the United States that hosted the San Francisco Conference, the American thinkers who developed the basic principles that were negotiated there, and many Americans who, in that first period, the first 10 years of the United Nations system, served in prominent positions not only in UNESCO, but throughout the United Nations system. So in the United States, of course, has also been a champion of democracy, as Louise mentioned, with respect to George W. Bush's motivations for joining UNESCO when he made that decision in 2003. And finally, I think we would all agree the United States should be a leader in the world, has usually considered itself, at least since the 20th century, a leader in the world. And I suggest that we need to think a bit about what leadership is, not just being number one, but the responsibilities and the risks that go with being a world leader. So with regard to the global community and the United Nations system in general, I think we're all aware that starting in the early 20th century, after World War I, during the debate over the League of Nations, predecessor to the United Nations, since that time there's been a debate between isolationism or America Firstism on the one hand, internationalism, globalism on the other hand. And that debate started as soon as anyone started talking about a global organization. In the case of the League of Nations, of course, it resulted in the U.S. Opting out. In the case of the United Nations, U.S. opted in, and not without considerable opposition and criticism from the congressional Republicans of the day. And I summarized the argument just by asking the question, is the U.S. in the global community acting as a sovereign or a citizen? Because the difference between the two has to do with how you feel the United States, what the role the United States should play. Should the United States control institutions in the international system, or should the United States be a responsible citizen and leader in those organizations? And we've seen, as Louise recounted in the case of UNESCO, that after a decade or so, after World War II, when the incredible predominance of the United States in the world began to be eroded by the positive phenomenon of the development of other nations becoming more powerful in every domain and more influential, the US was less able to control what happened in the entire United Nations system, both in New York, in the United Nations itself, and in all of the various specialized agencies and around the world that are governed by one nation, one vote. And so the choice is influenced, I think, by your worldview of how the United States should operate, and whether there's value added for the United States in being part of any organization that it does not control. So as Louise quoted, I won't dwell on this, but the reason that the US was a founding member of UNESCO, and it was this belief that defenses of peace must be constructed. And those defenses of peace are a reference to the soft power tools that UNESCO has at the core of its mandate in education, science, and culture. And George Bush decided to rejoin UNESCO, as Louise mentioned. I apologize for that cutting off of the words there. That peace demands strong foundations that bridge nations, enlarge freedoms, and promote democracy. And I think that the word foundation is very crucial there, because we are talking about education and culture, which are the foundation of the worldview of every nation in the world. And to the extent that the United States has the ability to have an influence over how those foundational features of countries develop, the United States can have an indirect influence on the way that other nations relate to us. So I would now like to just to talk a little bit about the core argument from my perspective. I would advocate that the United States cannot hope to be sovereign over all international organizations that are universal, especially in the 21st century, where the balance of power has become much less lopsided. When we had a moment at the end of the Cold War when it seemed that we were returning to the status of the United States at the end of World War II, and we had lots of academics developing a thesis of a monopolar world, or the end of conflict, end of history. And of course, that it was a moment. It wasn't the end of anything. And we have a problem of success. I think we can say that the U.S. management of the world institutions from 1945 through the end of the Cold War was wildly successful compared to aftermaths of previous major wars in terms of raising living standards, raising educational standards, raising the productivity of economies around the world. But inevitably, when other nations became wealthier and more powerful, they wanted to have more of a voice in how the world is managed. And that's reflected in any universal international organization. And I think Louise mentioned a figure briefly, 22%. That's the percentage of the assessed contributions of the United Nations agencies and the United Nations Secretariat that the United States pays today. But in 1954, that figure was about 39%. And at the inception, it was almost 50%. So if you use that number as a barometer of the degree of influence that the United States exerts, the 22% might even exaggerate the influence in the one nation, one vote organizations. But the U.S. has never, as a matter of official government policy, threatened to withdraw from the Central United Nations or the Security Council or the United Nations Secretariat or what we call the funds and programs. Those are the agencies that are funded by voluntary contributions. So thinking about the U.S. role in UNESCO, I think it's not possible without thinking about the U.S. role in the larger United Nations system. So if you take the example that Louise mentioned of the Palestine problem. The Palestine problem appears in every universal United Nations body. And even, of course, in the Security Council, which is a subset of the United Nations membership, where the United States does have a veto authority. But the General Assembly in New York is a one nation, one vote organization. And the United States has to deal with what is approved by that body. And we have never contemplated withdrawing completely, although during the time when Louise and I were working in this area, the US under the famous Ambassador John Bolton did threaten withholding assessed contributions from the Central United Nations as a way of achieving some management reforms. So I think it's worth asking, why is UNESCO different than any of the other universal bodies in the United Nations? So I wanted to emphasize that UNESCO is a global forum for dialogue on the components of soft power. And soft power is an area where we in the United States, I think, have prided ourselves for most of the post-war period of exerting our influence through programs like the Fulbright program, which I can tell you as a diplomat working in embassies overseas is nothing short of miraculous in terms of the ability to create and maintain relationships with very top of the elites in many countries. And everywhere I worked, it didn't matter opposition, governing party, there were always Fulbright graduates who were happy to meet with American diplomats and share their insights and be receptive to arguments from the United States. So soft power is, again, very important in affecting the foundations of society around the world. And it's on those foundations that political relationships are built. And of course, today, 21st century America, where everybody is on their cell phone, on some kind of social media, some amount of time a day, in some cases far too much time a day, the way they perceive the world is shaped by those media. And that we don't use the term soft power much anymore. We hear about social media, but social media is a place for soft power to be deployed. And I would submit that in a world like that, there is a constant conversation going on about issues that are important to foreign policy goals of the United States. And we are affected by that conversation, whether we like it or not. And I haven't been in the US government for almost 15 years, but my son and daughter-in-law both are, following in their father's footsteps as American diplomats. And they tell me that the problem of using social media in foreign policy has still not been satisfactorily resolved in the area of diplomacy. So it's a challenge that those who are trying to lead messaging for the United States confront every day of their lives. So I would argue that we can't ignore any forum that's shaping the narrative in the world, because we can't control where narratives originate, how they multiply, how they're, whether they go viral or not. And I think the bottom line for the argument for staying in UNESCO is that we should not miss out on the narrative constructing conversation that takes place there, because especially with China being so adept at the technology that supports social media platforms, and China having focused considerable resources on influencing UNESCO. If we're not there, then we can be sure that China will take full advantage of the UNESCO platform to lead message making around the world. So my last word is one that I hear from my youngest children, which is FOMO, fear of missing out. That's the best reason for remaining part of UNESCO. Thank you.
You want me to take up? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Jerry. When Ambassador Oliver called me and said, I want to do a debate about UNESCO, and do you want to do the pro or the con? And I thought about that. You know, do I? Because I worked with her and for her, and I spent 3 years of my life working to make U.S. participation in UNESCO effective. And I got to work with both Republicans and Democrats. I went over the change of administration. So my initial reaction was, well, yeah, we should definitely participate. And then I thought about it. I had to say to myself, if I had to make that decision now, would I have the United States participate in this particular organization? So I don't. So part of the answer on the FOMO is I wouldn't have us miss out on all of them. But if I'd been presented with a question on this one, I probably would have said no. And let me give you my framework for why I think so. To say a couple of things here at the start that I think almost everybody in the room knows, but let's reiterate them. The way I look at international organizations is, do they advance U.S. interest? Do we get something out of it? And not sort of the ideological, should we have these things or not, they're going to be there. Do they advance our interests? And the fundamental bargain in every international organization is, look, you give something to get something, you yield a little bit of sovereignty for the chance to promote coordinated action among a whole bunch of countries on some issue that you can't do on your own. And if we have an agenda that we want to promote, sometimes international organizations are very effective at doing it. That's why NATO and those other things have been so good. So is it a good deal? The question to me is it a good deal for the US to be in UNESCO, particularly? Let's see if we can move this on. Yeah. Okay. Again, many people in the room already know this. For the grad students back, let's review. International organizations carry two kinds of activities. They love to use fancy words, normative. But this is really all those resolutions, the decisions, in UNESCO, they can promote treaties. They set norms. And they have, UNESCO often tries to set best practice, establishes what are best practices, what are the proper ethics of something. And in doing that, it's adopting standards that UNESCO's 194 member states are pretty universal. It also does programs. There is an international staff that implements programs that are intended to assist member states in improving their educational systems and improving their scientific efforts. Culture is a broad term at UNESCO, but some things you may have heard of. World Heritage. We've all heard of World Heritage sites. Those occur under the banner of UNESCO. So many developing countries would come to you and say, look, we really need help. We've got this really cool site. We don't have any money to preserve it. It's gonna get destroyed unless can you help me do it? Can you help me save this? Has a pretty large international staff. It manages programs either out of the headquarters in Paris, but there are field offices on all the continents. And then it has something that we used to debate, Ambassador Oliver and Jerry and I, about Category 1 and 2 institutes. Category 2 institutes are institutes paid for by the member states, and Category 1s are paid out of UNESCO's budget. And you'll have like UNESCO, there are several institutes that are devoted to one aspect or another of education. Secondary education, I think, is one. You dealt with these more than I did. You can remind me of them. But significantly, as we're talking about China, China got agreed in the either Executive Board or General Conference last autumn for the creation of a Category 1 institute on, which I think is supposed to help countries develop their curriculum. It's going to be in Shanghai, and it's as I was in Paris in February and I talked to some old friends to see how they were doing. And one of them made the point to me, that's global. The Category 2 institutes are usually regional, will help study oceanography in East Asia or something, but no, this is global. So it opens the door for the Chinese to be active globally. That's significant. Many countries, just so you know, often give extra budgetary money above their dues to pay for UNESCO to carry out programs in areas that are of interest to them. We do too. When we were at UNESCO, we certainly did. Okay, so what's the problem? Those are all normative and programs should be good things, right? Well, I have bones to pick with how UNESCO does both of those. Education, science, and culture. It's a unique problem for UNESCO. There's some other areas where it's clear that there's a real international aspect. Education, science, and culture are domestic issues in the United States. We don't usually think of them as international issues. Many of them are dealt with mostly at the state level in the United States, to the extent we do it all. We used to have fun meetings at UNESCO, the culture in particular. Lots of people, lots of other states were very interested in culture. You'd sit around and I remember sitting in a meeting, somebody said, well, let's ask each country to describe its culture policy. We got to me and it said, we don't have one. What do you mean? You don't? No, we don't have one. I mean, France has a huge culture ministry. I forget how many billion euros a year it has as a budget. And many countries around the world have copied the French in this. They have ministries. We don't do it. So it's very hard. Who speaks for the United States on culture? And do we have an agenda we're really trying to promote here? I'm not sure we do. What I learned is that being there is not enough. If we're not going to get run over at UNESCO, everybody's mentioned the problem, we don't have a veto. So you have many member states popping up with what to me sounded like harebrained ideas. Ambassador, just one example, shortly after you left, the Brazilians popped up and they wanted to have a statement or something from UNESCO that would ban for-profit colleges. They were trying to influence policy in Brazil. But whoop, we can't go with that. No, I can't vote to ban for-profit colleges, but I don't have a veto. So you spent all day running through the room trying to line up state by state to prevent that. All right, so what if we're going to do UNESCO, I would advise, we should have an agenda. We shouldn't let other countries set the agenda. We should come in, we want to do this, we want to do that. Here's our draft resolution, here's our decision, here's the program we want to do, and we're going to put extra money behind it to make it, maybe the organization wouldn't buy it, but we've set the agenda. We've taken up a lot of the bandwidth on talking about something we like rather than some harebrained thing that some other country feels they want to do. So, program. It's got a large bureaucracy. They're not the sharpest bulbs, frankly, in my view. And I have this from, I was talking a week or two ago to a guy who was like the senior chief of the international staff. He said, oh, the organization's brain dead. Sort of put me back. Really? But a lot of people have been picked for their connections to people in their home countries. So it's been kind of a place, countries apart, well-connected people and non-demanding jobs in Paris. It's very resistant to hiring Americans. Another long gripe we had. The organization it's in Paris, most of the work is done in French. It's officially bilingual, but many meetings you go to, it's just in French. And it was very easy for the organization to say, well, no, your candidate doesn't speak French. I mean, not many Americans do. And so they just eliminated dozens and dozens and dozens of candidates we'd come up with. They don't speak French. No. So that's a gripe. And as I've noted, the Chinese have busily, over the years, in their patient way, have been putting people, particularly in the education bureaucracy there, which is now an issue. All right. So let's, all right, looking forward, what's going to happen now? There will likely be initiatives we can't block. UNESCO has recently taken a big interest in AI. I'm not sure they've got the expertise to deal with this, but they've announced a big program of writing a code of ethics for AI. They want to have a normative international instrument on the topic. We're poorly placed. We're going to be frustrated in trying to counter China. Again, going to Paris last month, everybody asked me, how long are you going to stay? You're going to stay past the end of the year? You guys are going to be gone before you know it. And that just left the whole delegation hampered. I mean, they could just wait you out now, or in the view of some. A lot's going to depend on whether we can get the current Director General, who's French. Her term expires at the end of the year, and there will be an election to replace her next autumn. We have got to put effort. If you're going to play the UNESCO game, you got to put effort now to find candidate or candidates that are good, that we can work with, and not just sort of leave it to drift. The Chinese would very much like to be heads of this organization. And I wouldn't be surprised to have a Chinese candidate emerge. So I wouldn't have come back, honestly, for the reasons I just said. And the question, I guess, it hangs here now, what damage will be done if we're not in UNESCO? Jerry, what damage will be done if we're not there? Thanks, that's it.
The election of the next Director General, they've decided to have their meeting in 2025 in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, not in Paris. That will guarantee that the lobbyists that a lot of the Western countries, a lot of the small countries, aren't going to make it. It's going to be a very interesting election, but we don't want to get sidetracked from that right now. What I'd like now is to have both our candidates, our speakers, Jerry and Steve, respond a little to each other. Jerry, would you just respond a little bit to what Steve said, where he doesn't think we should be in for the reasons he just described, and tell us how you disagree, and then, Steve, you do the same thing.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Oliver, and thanks, Steve, for that very interesting argument. The first point I would make is I don't think it's in the interest of the United States for long term to think of participation in United Nations organizations as a transaction. And we may not have a Ministry of Culture in the United States, but we certainly have in our market economy, we have a culture of transactionalism, and companies managing to the quarterly bottom line, to the stock price, and so on. And that mentality can affect other areas of civilization where it's not as appropriate. And we've joined and departed from UNESCO already twice, and we're now considering in this debate whether we should depart yet a third time. And I can assure you that if we continue treating the short-term expected gains or losses in UNESCO as if it were the next quarterly report or a stock price, we will never achieve any kind of durable influence, because it doesn't work like a stock market. It's culture is the deepest part of the foundation of human society, but it's also the most slowly changing, and the most powerful, and often the most implicit. So it's not an area where you can expect to come in with a PowerPoint pitch and get a sale immediately. It's an area where, like in the case of the Fulbright program that I mentioned earlier, investment over decades, regardless of whether every single person that gets a scholarship becomes a 100% supporter of every initiative of the current United States president. That's not how the Fulbright program worked, and yet it did yield tremendous benefits over time. So my first answer is it may be that nothing terrible will happen in the short term, if the U.S. were to withdraw again, but over time it would be impossible for the United States to rebuild the kind of long-term influence that UNESCO offers a potential for if we continue to treat it transactionally. I had a couple of other thoughts on should I go ahead with those, or should we continue on another point? So on the issue of the leadership elections, and I was responsible when I was at the State Department Bureau of International Organizations for managing leadership campaigns every time there was a vacancy in an international organization. So I have some experience with the one for UNESCO, International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Food Program, World Health Organization, and a number of other lesser known ones. And it is possible for the United States to have influence on leadership decisions, even with countries who may never want to admit that they're collaborating with the United States on one of these issues. But it requires diplomacy. It requires building relationships around the world. It requires using those relationships. It requires having a coherent strategy. And there I agree with Steve, we need to have one. But we had some really tremendous successes in that area. And just to give you one example, which I think is very relevant to all of us, since I think most of us get on airplanes once in a while, at the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal. They had an election during the time I was in the Bureau of International Organizations. And the leading candidate going into the election period a year out was a Russian who was managing the company that at that time was in Ukraine that bought the old Antonovs from the Soviet or Russian military and rented them out to many customers around the world, including the United States military at times, but anybody that needed to haul freight. So this gentleman had a lot of influence and relationships around the world, but we were able to mobilize and recruit some very unlikely allies to prevent the election of this Russian. And winner was actually French. And you know, I guess we could be cynical and say it's not much better than a Russian. They have Airbus after all. But I think the result was to prevent some serious erosion in the ability of the International Civil Aviation Organization to maintain airport safety standards around the world. And that's important to everybody that flies a plane.
But I'll just make one comment before turning it back to Steve, which is I think there's a difference between an organization, intergovernmental organization that has a particular thing like aviation and UNESCO. I want to go back to what Steve said right in the beginning, which was not a discussion about these international intergovernmental organizations as a whole, because there are some very good ones out there, some ones that we really should be part of that do good things. The thing about UNESCO is that it has this enormous mandate, enormous. It covers just about, I used to say that it did everything except weapons of mass destruction. It does almost anything. And it does almost anything because it will do whatever its member states want it to do. So if the member states have ministers of sport that want a new treaty, okay, fine, then they do a negotiated treaty. If their ministers want something else, they'll negotiate something else. And so with a huge mandate, it's very difficult to accomplish the kinds of things that the United States might want to accomplish, which is a little different than the aviation example. I might just say that Steve mentioned the word game. I see the multilateral diplomacy in a way as a game, and a serious game, a very serious game. But you've got to be able to know the rules. You've got to be able to play the game. When I remember meeting the German ambassador shortly after I got to Paris, and we were having a conversation about UNESCO and all the various programs it did or whatever. And then suddenly he turned to me and he said, "Do you play chess?" I said, "Yeah, I play chess." "Oh." And then we moved right on. And he was basically trying to find out, did I understand games? As I say, I use the word game advisedly because it is very serious, but that is what you have to be able to do when you have a huge mandate and 194 countries playing in this field. So Steve, let me turn it back to you.
Well, I think the most important question is the one Jerry raised about leadership. Honestly, when the first time we withdrew, I thought it would really damage the U.S. leadership in the world. I don't think it really did that much harm being out of UNESCO. I think if we start pulling out of a lot of other ones, it will. But to come back to my real emotion on UNESCO is if the United States is going to be in, it's got to step up and lead. You can't just sit there behind your nameplate and let the ideas come from Brazil or from China, which is very good for coming up with ideas, India. You have to come up and we have to put our effort into it. We have to come in with ideas, and then senior Americans have to be willing to spend time dealing with this. If we get a director general election, this should be worth people on the 7th floor of the department making phone calls about. There's a bandwidth issue, and we got to, I don't know, do we have the bandwidth? To me, the most awful outcome would be if we withdrew a third time. I mean, people were pretty sort of laughing in their cuffs a bit when I showed up in Paris last month. It's like, how long are you going to be here? You guys are going to go. You're not, but subtext says you're not serious. You're not really serious. I fear that if we keep coming and going, we're going to really send this decline signal that we really should not be sending.
So with that, let me open the floor to questions. Because one of the things that I might just mention up front is that this time around, when we, as I said earlier, when we went back into UNESCO, it was not argued that we needed to promote education or we needed to promote culture or whatever it is. It was argued that we had to somehow stop China from increasing its influence at the organization. That's a very different rationale than going in to help UNESCO accomplish its mandate. And so I think that presents, along with the unreliability of the US, I think that presents a certain problem. So questions from anybody? Linda, you start. Go ahead, Melanie.
So, one of the things I'm concerned about is we seem to re-enter with no agenda, unlike the Bush administration, where we had a clear agenda. Mrs. Bush was very active on literacy, but we also had other agendas, some of which Louise led on as soon as she got there and saw opportunities. So if you're playing the multi-dimensional chess game of UNESCO, you have to come in understanding the organization. Because China has outgained us totally in UNESCO because we come and go.
Agreed. I mean, yes, it was good in the Bush administration. When you came in, you had an agenda. There were things on education you wanted done. No, I don't see anything right now. That's why I said being there isn't enough. I very much worry we'll completely get outmaneuvered by just sort of sitting behind the nameplate.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could maybe point out, and please, whoever wants to respond, the two questions would be, can you give an example of a overwhelming success of that we got out of being part of UNESCO, and an example of an epic fail that did not work out? So just briefly, of course. Yes.
Which one of you wants to start with that? You do the success and you do the fail.
I think success, the thing that leaps to mind, especially for the years that I think we can talk about, that we're in UNESCO starting in the George W. Bush administration, is the literacy agenda. Because I think there's ample evidence for a tremendous improvement in literacy rates around the world in the years that followed the launching of that initiative. And it was not just Laura Bush using a bully pulpit, which she did very effectively, but it was also getting the World Bank to kick in some serious resources, to have U.S. institutions of higher learning and institutions expert in primary and other lower level education partner with the UNESCO staff that was managing the literacy campaign. So it was an engagement at many levels. But UNESCO provided the brand and provided a forum to promote that engagement, which probably would not have been possible if it was a 100% American-only initiative.
A fail, well, I'm trying to think. What strikes me is we were pulling out as this question of recognizing Palestine as a nation state emerged. But it seems to me that when we pulled out, we allowed that issue to kind of take over a lot of the work of the organization. They're having their executive board meeting like this week, and I know that there is a Gaza resolution on the agenda, and I can imagine that's going to be incandescent. But But it shouldn't block we shouldn't let it bring the whole organization, which is a global thing, to a halt. In the time I was there, we worked very hard. And I think one of the things I take pride in is that we were able actually to get a resolution on Jerusalem, as that was called at the time, that was agreed to by both the Arabs and Israel. Now, it took many hours in many different rooms up until the last minute of the thing, but we were eventually able to get an agreed resolution on Jerusalem. And I think it's sad we got away from that, and I think it's damaging the organization.
As an aside, these international organizations look at what each other do.
Yeah.
And yesterday, I guess it was yesterday, there was a Security Council resolution on demanding an immediate ceasefire, which the U.S. abstained on. The U.S. had proposed other resolutions which had been knocked down by the Russians and the Chinese. But this one, they let it go through by abstaining. So I will be very interested in this UNESCO Executive Board meeting, which is happening now. And we were told that the subject of the meeting was going to be Gaza and a ceasefire. Well, the U.S. position at UNESCO has to basically be very similar to the U.S. position at the UN. So the U.S. will not be able to block a UNESCO resolution on a ceasefire, having abstained in New York. So these organizations do look at each other and see what they're doing, and they do, when they can, piggyback on what goes on in different organizations. More questions?
I just wanted to give very briefly maybe a more dramatic example of a failure. First it was a success, and then it became a failure. And Louise and I were both at the World Heritage Committee in 2008. And we decided there were two big issues. One involved the Middle East, Palestine, and the other was Thailand versus Cambodia. And there's a temple on the border between Thailand and Cambodia called Preah Vihear, which is kind of a mini Angkor Wat. And it's recognized by the International Court of Justice as belonging to Cambodia. So Cambodia wanted to have it declared a World Heritage Site. And during that meeting, we negotiated an agreement between Thailand and Cambodia to shrink the size, to make some other small technical adjustments, but let the site be declared a World Heritage Site. So it seemed like a great success, and we were able to get a majority of the committee to agree with that. Then the minister from Thailand went home and was promptly fired. And a year later, there was a Thai mob showed up and perpetrated a massacre at the site on the border, and the military from both sides had to be brought in. So it was not successful in resolving the long-term conflict between the two countries. So it's an example where you have to be careful what you wish for. And it was not, it was coordinated with the rest of U.S. policy on Southeast Asia, properly at the time, but did not necessarily make the World Heritage Committee look great after a couple of years went by.
That was a nightmare. I used that word earlier. I was involved in that. It was horrendous. Mike.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. If you start from the premise with which I agree with Jerry Anderson, that you can't look at an organization like UNESCO through a transactional lens. Perhaps you may look at some other international organizations, perhaps like ICAO or others, where you can have more of a dynamic, a transactional dynamic. If you start from that premise, then and instead take the view that the better approach is to have a more pragmatic, hands-on use of soft power when and as opportunities arise. Then if you take all that into consideration and you go back to Steve Engelken's parting question, what damage is done in the absence of the United States at UNESCO, why isn't part of the answer to that you'll get things like the Cultural Diversity Convention, or that you plant and foster and nurture a norm of U.S. irrelevancy, because nations start to learn how to live within those IOs without the United States and without its money. And the other second part of my question is that how are U.S. interests advanced or not? And it seems to me that the answer to that question is, especially if you're going into UNESCO 3.0, how are U.S. interests likely and going to be advanced? Isn't the answer to that question, and I'm being quite serious about this, that you send a 2.0 Ambassador Oliver to that organization, because as the Chancellor said, and I watched her do this at UNESCO, effective first-rate diplomacy can actually soften opposition and actually bring on board people who you thought previously were unturnable, you might say, as well as, while you're there, expanding the field of advocates who will be promoting U.S. interests and goals, but making it seem as though they're their own. So it's not just the United States advancing U.S. interests, but common shared interests and goals that are being promoted by the Europeans and other parts of the world. I hope that's clear, but it's a two-part question.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for that question. And I was going to say, but I'll say now, another part of my answer to your, Steve's question at the end of his presentation, which, what will be the cost if the U.S. Decides not to remain in UNESCO? And the cost, as I said, would not be immediately apparent, but it would be a cost that would accrue over time in countries that are susceptible to influence from China. And we're already seeing, I'm sure you've seen media about it, or maybe even know more than I do, but across Africa, Chinese influence and Russian influence is dramatically increasing. And it's making it very difficult for U.S. And other NATO countries to have any pragmatic relationships on other things, such as counterterrorism and countering the Islamic State in the across the Sahel region in Africa. And there are countries also in Latin America, especially Central America, but also larger countries such as Peru, who are heavily influenced by China. And if the U.S. abandons the field at UNESCO and allows China to take over, China will be happy to use UNESCO as yet another tool to further entrench their relationships with those countries. And it all depends on your view of how important it is for us to maintain those relationships. But historically, the U.S. has thought it very important to maintain the ability to operate against terrorist groups in Africa. And they're in the era of cell phone and electric car battery minerals, the parts of Africa that produce those minerals, which happen to also be produced in China, it could have a very significant impact on the U.S. economy if China is able to buy influence to prevent the U.S. from sourcing those same materials, even from other countries that produce them outside of China.
Well, Jerry, I would like to follow up in agreement on this point. The Chinese have, I think, see UNESCO as a very important tool of soft power. And they have a worldwide push now, because they obviously copy us on a lot of things, and they're copying us on soft power too, to get international students to go to Chinese universities. Fulbright was such a good deal for us. Chinese have seen that, and they're working very hard. We have those Confucius Institutes all over the place. And if they're in UNESCO, I could just see a lot of subtle ways they could sort of predispose students coming from countries that aren't very wealthy, and what we're now calling the global South, I guess. You should ought to study in Beijing. And you should include Chinese on the curriculum of your schools. Instead of learning English, they should learn Chinese. I mean, you can see that it isn't a big problem yet, but over time it could be. And I'm sure it's what they intend. Yeah?
So I'm not going to try and disguise this as a question. It's a comment. But when I was listening to Jerry and Steve and Ambassador Oliver earlier, I was trying to think of this quote, and I looked it up. It's the Czech writer Milan Kundera, who wrote during the Cold War time. I think this is a quote that resonates with anyone that comes from a place that was authoritarian. It's the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. And that quote is my starting point in my intervention. When we all talked about Archibald MacLeish and what he wrote in the founding documents for UNESCO, he talked about building peace in the minds of men. It's a hearts and minds organization. It's a place that decides what gets remembered and what doesn't. It may think that that's what it does. And when you think about who makes the World Heritage List, or who starts a level 1, I forget the term.
Category 1.
Category 1 institution on curriculum. UNESCO is the only UN agency that has a specific mandate for media freedom and freedom of expression in its founding documents. So when you look at those types of things, those are instruments that help us decide what we remember and what we forget. And I think the United States broadly doesn't invest in soft power the way we invest in hard power. And if we are to be at UNESCO in a serious way, we need to do it with more talent than we have in the past, more seventh floor focus than we've had in the past, and see the soft power focus of UNESCO the way our adversaries see it, which is as a very important tool in the kit for hybrid warfare.
So, a couple more questions and then we'll break and continue this conversation at the reception.
So Ambassador, maybe from the other perspective from the comment we just had, if you were to go back and revisit those complaints that were made in the Reagan administration in 1984 about the waste and abuse within UNESCO and the other sort of anti-American activities that were counter to our interest, would they still be valid? And isn't there a case to be made that we are not necessarily locked into every organization, international organization, that came out of the World War II framework? Some were good ideas, some were not good ideas, and then we don't have to continue to fight the battle of soft power in this framework. We can let it go. I would imagine, based on the $80 million figure, we're talking about maybe $500 million total budget for UNESCO.
Yes.
We don't have to fight that battle. And perhaps there are moments where we should say, we will disengage and do it a different way. But back to the core question, 84, the Reagan complaints, are they still valid?
No. Linda, you might know more than.
Well, first of all, I want to state very clearly, when we left UNESCO, we continued to invest programmatically during the Reagan administration in science activities and world heritage. So even though Reagan left, they identified a number of things we wanted to influence, and our observer engaged in a lot of politics at UNESCO. And that was very important to keep us in the game.
And I think that, I keep going back to the word game. If you're going to play the game, you play to win. You don't play the game to lose. And if we go and stay in UNESCO, we have to have the resources, the skill, the brains, the passion, the agenda to make it worthwhile. Otherwise, you end up inadvertently, and I hate to sound like Trump, but looking like a loser. And that is not good for the United States. In terms of the period that Reagan was talking about, no, it's not corrupt in the same way. It's not mismanaged in the same way. That was during the period of the Cold War. And during that period, things were really quite out of control of UNESCO, and we didn't have the ability to find out what was really going on and fix it. So Reagan was right to leave because there was just no way you could fix that organization from the inside. But it's not like that now. Certainly, Director General Matsura did a huge, really made a lot of progress in terms of reforming the organization. But having said that, the problems now are not corruption per se, but inefficiency. Are there better ways to spend the money? Is the U.S. able to motivate its goals, its foreign policy goals, through this particular organization? So it's more those kinds of questions as opposed to questions of corruption and mismanagement.
I could add, the one difference between the 80s and now is the US and France are much closer. I don't think we forget, because I was among those long list of postings I had, I was desk officer for France in 89, 91. And it was in the period where it was always the différence française. Whatever we said, they would say no. It was the first answer for anything the Americans did. We have been able to work together a lot better recently, because the French don't want to lose that organization. They were very worried that, because it's one of their claims to being this world capital. They have this international organization. They don't want that organization to fall apart. And I think Madame Azoulay has put a lot of effort also into cleaning up the worst corruption.
But I would just make one comment, Steve, which is you were my second chief of staff.
Yeah.
The years that you were not there, the 2 years, there was in fact a major battle with France. We walked in because the French, Chirac, wanted to pass a treaty on cultural diversity, the protection and promotion of the diversity of cultural expressions. That was the name of the treaty. And the French paired up with the Canadians. They persuaded allies, they bribed allies, they did everything you could possibly do in order to get enough votes to promote this treaty and promote it fast. And the reason they wanted it fast was that the U.S. had just come back into UNESCO, and they were very worried that when we learned how to play the game the way they knew how to play it, that we would somehow be able to stop this treaty. And we didn't like the treaty because we had no idea what it meant. What does protection mean? Well, you know it when you see it. What does promotion mean? Well, you promote something. What's a cultural expression? Well, almost anything, everything's cultural. It was those are the kinds of answers we got. And we said we cannot support a treaty where we have no idea what it means. This is a legal obligation, we have no idea. Anyway, this was a major issue between the French and ourselves. But going back to what Mike just said, publicly, the U.S. and France were on absolute different sides on this. We did not want that convention to pass, and the French would do anything and everything to get it passed quickly. So we fought publicly. Privately, the French ambassador and I were very, very good friends. And he was charming. He was French. He was charming. And we had a great time together. But we were representing our governments. And that's what you do. And so he was representing what his president, Chirac, told him to do. Get it passed. And get it passed quickly before the U.S. manages to stop it. And our brief was, stop it. It was basically too late. It was, as Mike knows only too well. It was too late. The momentum was going strong. There was no way to stop it. Especially since they did things that were, shall we say, against UNESCO regulations. It was incredible what they did. But they won. They got the thing passed. And so after that, the French decided to be nice to us, partners, and we worked together publicly very well. But it was only after that convention was passed.
Well, it was after Chirac left.
And after Chirac, who did not.
Sarkozy came in and changed French theology.
That's true.
Because it was Sarkozy who returned France to the military end of NATO. And after that was really, I was stunned when he did it. And when he did it, that moved French policy significantly toward us. It's never going to be, they're never going to say yes. But it's, yes and now rather than no. I take that, I guess.
So, Phil, I'm going to give you the last question, and then, oh, I'm sorry, is there
The red
someone?
hat.
Where?
What's that?
Did you have a question?
I did.
Have you been trying to ask a question? Maybe
She
it's
said her hand
because,
raised.
maybe it's because you're sitting directly behind these people here and I never even saw you.
Oh,
And so why don't you ask your question?
well, it just seems like the UNESCO is prefaced by that every country has a right to be proud of themselves. And every country has a right to have their own interests at heart. I'd like someone to explain to me why I should be so afraid of China or India or Brazil or Russia when China, for example, has a population that could replace every single man, woman, and child here 3 times over. That they would take the global stage as far as production, economy, and have a vested interest in 3 times the population. And if India is added to Asia, that's another billion people. Like that, I don't think of that as taking over the world so much as you're trying to accommodate a country that needs 3 times as many resources, 3 times as much food, 3 times as much healthcare, 3 times as much medicine, that you took charge of UNESCO. I get it. Like what happens if we're not leading? What happens if we're just any other country? What happens if we're just France? What happens? Why do we need to take control of UNESCO?
Jerry, I'll start with you. Then I'll go to Steve. And then we're going to wrap this up.
Yeah, that's a very,
big question.
very fundamental question, and I did allude to that in my presentation about the role of the U.S. in the world. And we're living in a world today where the capabilities of other major powers are much larger relative to ours than they were after World War II or even 20 years ago. Your question was framed in a kind of a philosophical way, and today I think we're faced with an issue that's not just about our philosophy about whether we must control things, but it's also looking at the reality of the power dynamics in the world, especially with the other nuclear powers. So I don't know if there's a good answer to that question, but the U.S. has evolved from the famous American century, the 20th century, of becoming the preeminent world power, and then succeeding in raising others to a level from which they can exert significant competition with the United States. So I think we all need to decide how we feel about that, and whether we should try and roll things back to the way they were, which I personally think is not realistic, or should we find a better way to live with the reality that is the world today.
Yeah, it seems like the reality is that, we're close to the French, but they were a former empire. We must make inclusive.
Obviously, every country, the definition of sovereign nations is that they defend their interests. So there's nothing that makes me unhappy or surprised that each country defends its interests. I spent a lot of time talking to St. Lucia, which was very active at UNESCO. They have their interests, and they promoted them. Remember, I took the con, so I was saying, basically if we can't, I'm not sure we need to be dominating UNESCO or we need to be in it. But I think if we're going to be in it, we have to maintain political support here, and we have to think of U.S. interests. If we're going to be in it, we have to lead. But what do I mean by that? I mean, we have to come up with ideas and initiatives and things for it to do. Just being passive, I don't think I think that we will be very unhappy with the decisions it makes. I would like us to lead in the sense of coming up with ideas for it to do. And China, the interests, the other thing that strikes me is, why do we care? Because ultimately we care about jobs in the United States. And we were very worried about the closures of factories in my home state, Ohio, a few years back. That's left a big scar. Some of that competition went to China. And so it does, affect the daily life of ordinary Americans. Anyway, what I would like to see the United States come up with ideas for ways to use it. You're going to be there, use it.
I have one more point I
Last point. Last point, Jerry.
and I realize this is an educational institution, and you heard Steve mention that how hard it, in his experience, it was to get Americans to be appointed to positions within UNESCO. And I just wanted to mention that since I did have 7 years experience in the United Nations system, and was responsible for human resources in my organization, I can tell you that it's really very simple. That in the United Nations system, all professional positions in every agency, including UNESCO, require knowing at least 2 United Nations languages fluently. And those are the 6 languages: English, Spanish, French, Chinese, Arabic, Russian. So to the extent that any of your students think they might have an aspiration to ever work in the United Nations system, they need to realize that they need to have at least 2 of those languages. Any of the 2 is usually fine, unless the organization is regional in nature. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.